Thank you so very much. First of all, thanks to my brother and friend Handel Wright. What you do not know about Handel actually is that you want to get him on the dance floor. And you're going to have some reggae on, and when he goes like pop, 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 he really means it. So thank you so very much, Handel. Sunira, your center sounds to me like my ultimate and heaven kind of work, and definitely very much appreciated your invitation. I know also there's a lot of people, if you are ever invited to one of these conferences, there's a lot of people who are doing a tremendous amount of work, from the photographers to people who set up the thing, Patrick there, and all of you. But especially I want to thank actually Carol Wallace, who's been doing a tremendous job. So sincere thanks to all of you. And big up to UBC, by the way. We need to start somewhere, and you're doing much better than we are doing at University of Ottawa. And clearly, I want to pay homage to this place, to this land, to its people. It's the smallest contribution that I can offer, and I want you to think with me as I progress in my presentation. I hope you bear with me if I read through some of my notes here. I titled my work, my presentation today, Notes from the Underground. And if you're familiar with Dostoevsky, it's one of his books, Notes from the Underground. The subtitle is Cultural Studies Methodology, and there's a reason why I use methodology as opposed to praxis, and I want to problematize this later in my work. Sociality and the praxis. Although I critique it, I reclaim it back again for within what I'm proposing as Project Citizen. Before I begin, however, let me warn my Russian friends and brothers and sisters in the audience that they are the ones who squarely and directly responsible for me thinking about developing the concept of the underground. Because, as Fyodor Dostoevsky put it, the underground people are Russian. You're supposed to smile now. If you disagree with this absurd contention, bring your fight directly, I highly recommend, to Dostoevsky and not to me. We, the people from the underground, declared Dostoevsky. My aim in this presentation and paper is to look at how the underground people talk back to the above ground people, on whose term social norms are formed. Using three desperate and different examples that I either witnessed or went through, I intend to reflect on how a group of disadvantaged students, with their teacher's guidance, were able to use cultural studies methodology and Project Citizen to address their social plight, which is best described as disadvantaged and depressing. The first example, odd as it may sound, comes from the outskirts of Lviv, Ukraine, where a group of students, and I will show all of these examples, where a group of students used old t-shirts to talk about alcohol abuse. The second example is from northern Senegal, where students used local traditional griot and dance to convince the government and the rebel to sign a peace agreement. The third example is from Mohammedia, a small oceanic town near Casablanca, Morocco. Here, students use orality, O-R-A-L-I-T-Y, and A-U-R-A-L ITI. To mobilize a town to rebuild the wall of a middle school, to semiotically understand these three examples. The paper will be grounded on a pragmatic definition of cultural studies methodology as we rethink how to address social justice and social issues. Project Citizen, and I really want us, as I move into my presentation, I want us to think about how it can be used and the utility of it. Project Citizen will be my notes from the underground, where I am concluding with an example from the Bay Area, using hip-hop example in California. New and exceptionally creative work is being done. In the beginning was Stuart Hall. And Stuart Hall argues that we need to think about what we mean by both social justice and the politics of radical conjunction. And this is what he's calling for. In his conversation with Les Back, Stuart Hall offers what describes not only my approach to scholarship, but for why we as public intellectuals do what we do. And I very modestly include myself and my work here as a public intellectual. At a certain point, Stuart Hall argues, round about the point where cultural terrain went into high gear, I was nearly, surprisingly, lost in the species of Allenquism. And I suddenly thought through this. At the point where people kept making French puns in English, and then he laughs about it, it did not work in English. In French, it did not work in English. It only worked in French. And he continued to argue that this is a crazy, crazy idea, not to be grounded and not to having one's own voice. And he ends up concluding that section by, we need to write our own stories. Then he moves on. And I realize almost everything I write is a kind of political intervention. It may not be about politics explicitly, but it is trying to shift the terms of the debate, intervene on one side or the other, clarify something, wipe some other distorting views out of place so that something else can come through. I am aware that that's a kind of political intervention. And that speaks to Senera's point. I'm interested in the conjunction, Stuart Hall argues. And he offers the example of Marx and capitalism here. He argues you need theory not to produce more theory, but because you can't do without it. The end result, however, he adds, adding more, the need to add more, another layer or more level of determination before you produce what he calls the concrete in thought. This is what I'm calling Marxism without guarantees, which gives me social justice without guarantees. The work is done by historical specificities, Stuart Hall argues. I think conjuncturally. I am a radical conjuncturalist. So I'm calling this section section thinking conjuncturally, introducing the banal. let's start with the banal, since as Socrates has argued, the banal is always the most difficult. What do we mean by cultural studies methodology? And what is Project Citizen? Why am I calling it cultural studies methodology and not cultural studies praxis, as Handel Wright calls it? I will take for granted that first, that cultural studies is a discourse that had its institutional origins at the center of contemporary cultural studies at the University of Birmingham. Second, I take it for granted that the British intellectuals that gave cultural studies its name and set up the center were interested in developing a discourse that would allow them to undertake progressive activism in a way, in academic setting, and to address pressing issues of social justice in and through culture in ways that were not constrained by the limits of specific disciplines. This is Handel writing. These intellectuals were not interested in pinning down a definition of cultural studies. Hence, they opened it up as a multidiscipline, as interdiscipline, as antidiscipline. Even though their preferred research methodology is qualitative in nature, namely ethnographic, they prefer to be multi-methodologist. Given the centrality of social justice in their work, the question for them, as Megan Morris put it, is not what is cultural studies, although that question is quite significant, but what Handel Wright calls the potentially activist question, and that is, what does cultural studies do? It is within this activist question that my paper and presentation are situated and articulated. However, describing cultural studies as multi-method discourse is, for me at least, tautological. It is almost saying nothing. And this is the moment when I would say, booyah, in your face, cultural studies. Imagine a beginning researcher who is told that cultural studies is multi-method and anti-discipline. If I were that student, I would have freaked out on the one hand and run away from it on the other. Not to make life easier for our students and give them false hope, but I want to take Morris's question very seriously and ask, what does cultural studies do? I want to flip the script, as we say in hip-hop, and ask the question differently, however. That is, since I'm not ready to delve into what Handel would pioneer as cultural studies praxis, I want to formulate Megan Morris's question differently. I want to bring the orphan child of cultural studies, that is education, namely K-12, to the forefront. Once education is introduced to cultural studies, and cultural studies is introduced to education, then the question becomes, what does cultural studies do in education? I'm afraid not too many people are thinking and dealing and asking that question. So I'm proposing Project Citizen as a concrete illustration of what cultural studies does in education. This is premature, but here we go. Are you ready though? The underground people are coming. Humor, I want to argue, can be one of the best pedagogical tools, both in teaching as well as in researching. So with quite a bit of humor, and I want to see some smiles here, I want to take you to Salon, a very comfortable dining room where we will sip some tea or coffee as you prefer, and listen to Brother Dostoevsky, who shall speak a little bit about the underground people. By the way, Dostoevsky explains, the absolute best thing that underground people know that others do not is this: they have an exceptionally defined sense of the sublime and the beautiful. Because material possessions are not so abundant, underground people therefore love their tea, they love their coffee, and they definitely love their vodka. Russian friends. With a lot of humor, again, Dostoevsky makes it clear that age is a big issue, because no one lives beyond 40 years old. Because to live longer than 40 years is bad manners, is vulgar, immoral. Who does live beyond 40? Answer that sincerely and honestly. I will tell you who do. Fools and worthless fellows. This is what I would say, ouch. Clearly for me, no one is worthless, but quite a number are worth less. Apparently these worth less people, these underground people, live in wretched, horrid condition and in the outskirts of town. These outskirts of town are what the French would call banlieue, what Dostoevsky, and I love that term, calls the unintentional towns. The ghettos, the wrong side of the tracks, the east side of Vancouver. And this is when I would ask, can I get a witness here? Where underground people live, people who are assumed to be or should have been dead, as Tupac would argue, but they're still alive. Again, precisely because of the sublime and the beautiful are not so abundant, underground people tend to appreciate them more. They are too conscious of their value, but being too conscious, Dostoevsky contends, is the curse of the underground people. Because of their double consciousness, as Du Bois would have argued, they know where they are in terms of material possession and desire. And at the same time, they know it can be otherwise. Here, I think Dostoevsky got it wrong, that to be too conscious is an illness. This is his term. It is a desired outcome for me. Acknowledging their full consciousness, still, what role does education in general, and cultural studies in particular, play in raising and expanding underground people's consciousness? I will show Project Citizen might be an answer, a very simple and modest and humble answer to a very difficult question. So what is this thing that I'm proposing here today, Project Citizen? Initiated by the Center for Civic Education in Calabasas, California in the 1980s, Project Citizen is a middle and high school oriented education program that is guided by John Dewey's notion that we need to make each one of our schools an embryonic community life, active with types of occupations that reflect the life of the larger society and permeating throughout with the special of art, with the spirit of art, history, and science. When the school introduces and trains each child of society into membership within such a little community, saturating him, with the spirit of service and providing him with the instruments of effective self-direction, we shall have the deepest and best guarantee of a larger society which is worthy and lovely. As a program, the objective of Project Citizen is not only making students in general and students from the underground in particular conscious of their social location, but equip them with the intellectual toolkits to question the adequacy of that location. The question for Project Citizen is this: how do we make our students own their social and physical environment? And exactly, concretely and pedagogically, how do we do that? Ultimately, as a kind of an outcome for Project Citizen, we need to make our students espousing what I'm calling agnostic civility. That is a marketplace of ideas that is perpetually open to the new and working for a better future that is yet to be fully envisioned and put into place. Here, Project Citizen becomes a deeply progressive, political, and democratic program that seeks theorizing, a ground-up approach that acknowledges that there is no practice that does not have a theory. There is no practice that does not have a theory. Where theory can be explicit, but it is actually implicit most of the time. Project Citizen is fully aware of the grand narrative of what Hannah Wright calls theoretism. That is a general academic valorization of theory, especially high theory, as privileged, prestigious, and an end in itself, and hence understandably insular and self-referential. Of course, Hannah Wright continues to argue that cultural studies is not immune to this conception, and there is a constant danger that students and faculty and the discourse of cultural studies itself will be engulfed by the attractions of facility with theory. Against this backdrop of theoretism, Hannah Wright proposes 8 ways to think about cultural studies praxis, which is directly related to what I'm proposing here as Project Citizen. As praxis, cultural studies, Hannah Wright sees cultural studies as 1, a way of studying formerly neglected subjects. And I invite you to think about this place and these people as an example. Second, cultural studies is also a means of taking seriously what has been traditionally neglected in the academy as unserious or unworthy of serious study. I'm thinking about my own work around hip-hop and so on. Third, it's also a way of bringing out and taking seriously the perspectives of previously marginalized groups in society. I'm thinking women's history, I'm thinking First Nations history. Cultural studies is also the ethnographic study and performance of culture. And here I'm thinking about the kind of the everyday thing, be it in a concert hall or at a party. Cultural studies is also a way of taking up projects that will address issues of social justice and radical democracy. And the RAGA's work in this area is a perfect example of why that is the case and why we need to think about it. Cultural studies is also a way of dealing with culture in the so-called postmodern age. That's the grand narratives. Before last, cultural studies is the utilization of critical theory in undertaking a socio-political project for social justice ends. And finally, it is intellectual political activism heavily informed by theory. What I will do next is to show how these definitions that Wright proposed are taken up in a classroom context, namely within the context of K-12. But I will use Project Citizen as an example and my venue into the discussion. But before doing so, and for precisely that last reason, that is being heavily informed by theory, what that I'm calling my approach methodology for precisely that reason. Or at least calling for a revisit to what do we actually mean by notion of praxis. As we shall see, the students I work with are not interested in, and I hate to bring it to you, in theory. That is the grand narrative or theoretism. As a teacher, you have to come to theory through the back door. I will show what I mean in a minute. For now, however, it is worth saying a few words about Project Citizen and namely why I'm calling for it to be as an approach. It begins with, as I said before, with this question: how do we make our students aware of their social environment and ask this question pedagogically? How exactly do we do that? Be very warned, once we have precise and step-by-step approach, have a flag right there. But I'm going to suggest it as a way, as a discussion point. Project Citizen has 6 concrete steps. First thing, democratically, let's imagine ourselves as a class. We will have a discussion about a social issue around us. And we collectively, as a class, first of all, we start by naming what the issues are. And then we decide collectively, not that others are not significant, but what is the most urgent one that we need to think about and talk about. In other words, we need to name an issue or a problem that we need to talk about. And this can be as simple as how to collect the garbage, and as huge, as you're going to see, as peace agreement. Second step, second point in Project Citizen. Once students identify the problem, in other words, there is an issue that they need to address, the second thing they do is they start their research. And here, students actually are introduced to the notion of research, to what it actually means and how to do it. So I work with them on how to start research and what it is. So students here become researchers. Third point, gathering and presenting and collecting the collected data. That is, students as public speakers and research presenters who will actually eventually make a policy proposal. So that's the third thing. So now at this point, we as teachers will work with them on how to present the material and the research that they came up with. The fourth is proposing alternative policy. In order for students to be able to do that, they need to be more than familiar with the existing policy. Fifth is implementing, or the implementation of alternative policy. In other words, students will actually do what they propose. And finally, the sixth point is they reflect on the learning experience. So I'm going to start with Ukraine. And I titled this Using T-shirts, Ukraine and the Politics of New Public Speech. In the spring of 2006, 2 colleagues from the US and myself experienced cultural studies at work. We were given a sneak peek into the possibilities of cultural studies method. It began with a trip to the beautiful Lviv. I don't know if you've ever been there, it's gorgeous. a lovely historical city in western Ukraine. We were hosted for 10 days by the executive director of the All Ukrainian Association of Teachers of History and Civic Education, also known as Nova Boda. Our invitation was part of the programmatic education and exchange between Bowling Green State University, where I was teaching, and Ukraine. We were taken to different schools, but there was one particular school that caught my attention. And we visited that school in an afternoon. And it just so happened that it was in the outskirts of town. It's a poor school at the outskirts of Lviv. And the class that got my interest, or piqued my interest, is a grade 9. So that class was conducting a project Citizen. As a class, the students decided that alcohol abuse was a serious problem that they would like to address. And so as their project Citizen, the first thing they do is they identify the problem. Second thing is they start their research. And this is where I was witness to that moment. It is worth mentioning that the students actually had statistics of alcohol consumption, how often, and so on and so forth. Second, they had tons and tons of newspaper articles on the issue. They actually had academic research. And they conducted interviews with 2 doctors who were working in this area. They conducted interviews with actual people who are going through the difficulty of alcohol consumption, aka alcoholics. They conducted interviews with all of their parents. And they conducted interviews with 2 managers from the municipality and 1 lawyer. In short, they had yay high mass of information. When I looked at it, if it's not an MA thesis level kind of research, it was at least an honors research. Then, in a normal project Citizen, once the students collected their information, they are supposed to present it to the concerned persons and propose and implement alternative policy. This is the kicker. These students decided, based on the research they have done, that their parents were part of the population that was affected by alcohol abuse. So given the delicacy of the situation, and not to moralize their parents, they decided, instead of talking to the concerned people, they decided to create a public speech, a new kind of public speech, one that publicized their research findings and engaged others in the conversation. They decided to use old, torn t-shirts. So using their pens and pencils and markers, in these t-shirts they identified the serious problem of alcoholism. They offered their research findings, including statistics. They wrote testimonies of alcoholics. And it just so happened some of these testimonies came from their parents. And finally, as part of the proposed alternative policy, they proposed 2 alternative policies. One is to have regular meetings between the people who were affected by alcohol and the professionals who were working in counseling them, namely doctors. They made the names, the phone numbers available to everybody. And the students will monitor the meetings between the people who are affected by alcohol and the counselors. The second policy that they proposed is to, this same project the T-shirt project, Citizen, shall be redone again in 6 months to see their progress. You have to keep in mind all of this was happening inside the classroom. That is, the students are done with their research, the research is written, the T-shirts are up, the policies are proposed, and the big question is, okay, what is next? Can I get a witness here? You have to imagine this. It's 5 o'clock in the morning, Monday. Students decided to use these T-shirts and hang them around downtown. If you've ever been in third world countries, or even Southern Europe for that matter, especially Italy and Greece, my love to people in Greece, no problem. You have to imagine the clothes and linens are hanging from the windows or from one building to the next. They literally, you have to imagine this, they literally filled downtown Lviv with these T-shirts. Especially the central bus stop where most of the workers either take or transfer buses. Once these underground people got off the bus, guess what is facing them? T-shirts. It was a coup. All media were talking about it, including radio, TV, and there was a special TV program that was done on this, and the students were interviewed, and it did create a very interesting follow-up, and that is the TV decided that they were going to follow the same students 6 months later and see what they have done. These are kind of some of the pictures that were the students themselves. Too bad that it's not as clear. To both the sky in smoke oblivious, it was blue, and the clouds resembling ragged refugees. I shall bring the dawn of my ultimate love, bright as a consumptive's flush. With rejoicing I shall blanket the roar of the assemblage, oblivious of comfort and home. Listen to me. This day, let me embrace new feet, perhaps outliving these times of harrowing as bayonets, steels. In centuries with whitened beards, we alone shall remain, you and I, chasing after you from city to city. The second example is, I'm titling it, Rebuilding the Wall, the case of Mohammedia, Morocco. My colleague Alden Craddock of Maryville University, St. Louis, Missouri, and I received a substantial grant to develop a civic education program that links schools, teacher education programs, and the university. Fully aware of our colonial position as people who were coming from the US, our intent in this project was to hand the project over to the Moroccans, since no one knows Morocco better than the Moroccans themselves. And we were to become simply a supporting cast. Among the pedagogical choices they have made, the Moroccans decided to implement Project Citizen as their chosen educational program. In March 2008, and as part of our program evaluation, we visited a middle school in Mohammedia, a poor, small oceanic town near Casablanca. At the time, at the school, as always, we received a king's reception, literally. You should have seen the food. It's awesome. Parents were there as well. After the reception was and away from the limelight, I volunteered to teach an energetic mixed group of grade 8 boys and girls. Switching back and forth between Arabic, French, and English, I realized that the students could hold their conversation steadily in English. One girl, and I shall call her Nawal from here on, in particular piqued my interest. She was adamant about going to Al-Akhawain University. This is the UBC of Morocco, the Harvard of Morocco for sure. This is a private university that is financed jointly by two kingdoms, the Moroccans and the Saudis, and built Harvard style. That kid, Nawal, was adamant about going to that school. She was adamant also that she was going to get a scholarship. You have to imagine this tiny girl from a very poor family who speaks English fluently. And for those of us who are interested in language, she actually learned her English from watching movies and listening to music. Dostoevsky speaks here. Underground people are coming. Anyway, as I progressed into my lesson and halfway into it, Nawal narrated what became a transformative experience for her, the class, the school, the community at large. She took me by the hand and asked me and the class to come out in the schoolyard and showed me a new wall. Do you know when it was built? How it was built? She wondered with a smile. I said, can you tell me? I don't, actually. She said, well, she has that kind of finger talking, well, let me tell you the story of the wall. Apparently, the wall had been crumbling for years, but about 2 years before the wall had to be rebuilt, something had to be done. It all started when the girls were doing gym, which was done outside in the schoolyard. The boys and a lot of guys were peeking over the wall, watching the girls doing gym. One day, Nawal told me there were so many guys watching that half of the girls refused to practice gym. That same year, Project Citizen was introduced in the school by their female English language teacher. Students chose the wall as their Project Citizen. They needed to address as the problem or the question that they needed to address. This Project Citizen is led by the girls who call themselves, by the way, FBI. Filles belles et intelligentes. Girls beautiful and intelligent. As part of their research for this project, students pinned down the cost of rebuilding the wall. Then one day, after Friday prayer, the girls led a march of the school through town to the mosque. It was a musical march where parents also joined in. Once at the mosque, they took up the mic and told the town about their problem and called on the town to come together and rebuild the wall. Exactly a month later, the wall was rebuilt with a taller and a higher height. A contractor, I was told, along with every parent, came out and helped in the construction every weekend for 4 weeks. as Khalil Gibran would have put it, love's possession at that point is moving. Beauty is waving her banner. Youth is sounding the trumpet of joy. Disturb not my contrition, my blamer. Let me walk, for the path is rich with roses and mint, and the air is scented with cleanness. The third example of Project Citizen, what I'm calling In Search for Peace, the case of Senegal. A real griot that you're looking at told me this story. A friend and a colleague of mine, Boubacar Tall. He told me this story in Dakar while the kids in question were present. Ravaged by the war in northern Senegal between a rebel group and the federal Senegalese government, this mixed group of boys and girls decided that their Project Citizen was going to be peace. After doing their homework and gathering as much information about the war and the reasons behind it, they decided that their alternative policy is peace. The kids invited the government represented in its Minister of Interior and the rebel represented in its chief negotiator. You have to think about this. These are high school students doing all of this. They secured a day and time for the negotiation between the two parties. However, that day, instead of simply inviting them to talk and bridge their differences, they decided to engage both parties through griot songs. And this is one of the songs that they were sung at the ceremony. In fact, the students explained to me there was never any talk while the two parties were there. It was all singing and dancing. And particularly at 7 o'clock, the students performed, and I didn't know about this before, Sabar, Senegalese music and dance. Concluded the government and rebel were at least smiling at each other. Both were then taken to a hut where students actually pleaded their cases, showing what they found in their research and in terms of monetary and human cost. That night, Boubacar tells me a memorandum of understanding was signed with students' continued pressure. Are you ready for this? A peace agreement was signed, but a year later, unfortunately. Peuple du continent noir, hommes du Sahel, de la forêt, hommes de la savane et du grand désert, Africain, mon frère, voilà, et mon son. Écoute ta musique. Elle est la voix de nos dieux et celle de tes ancêtres. Dans le soir, beaucoup de veillées, nous grillons après un moment de profond recueillement. Joue sur la guitare l'air d'un tara. I'm calling this before last section, Praxis versus Method, taking cultural studies to a whole another level. Succinctly summarized, there are three trends that Hannah Wright warns us against when engaging cultural studies. One, not to neglect the adult education origin of cultural studies in favor of what he calls theoretically sophisticated narrative. Second, not to marginalize social class by turning the triplet of race, class, and gender into race, gender, and sexual orientation. Third, not to neglect praxis, which he sees as the blending of theory and practice, of course following the Freudian discursive framework. Fully aware of the third last point, Henry Giroux recently reminds us that we need to give students a heavy dose of cultural studies theory and theorizing, with a special emphasis on social difference. Not to fall into the trap of the armchair theorizing, Wright reminds us that we need to couple this heavy dose of cultural studies with service learning. This is all for me lovely and dandy. But what the hell does it mean in a K-12 context? Humor aside, this is a question that is hardly asked by cultural studies. Maybe what my friend Samuel Lim of Stanford University implemented in the Bay Area might give us a hint, might be a partial answer to what Giroux and Wright are arguing for. Let me explain. Built around and as critical hip-hop language pedagogies, the question for Alim was this: working with middle and high school students who are predominantly African American in the Bay Area, California that is, how do we make these students aware and own their own speech on the one hand, and aware of the sociolinguistic variation in general on the other? To answer this question, you have to, it's just fantastic. Alim actually trains these students to become ethnographers who document and collect their own speech data from their local community. So not only their own, but also the people around them. That's how we could start. The project is called Real Talk. Real talk is an idiomatic expression that builds upon what Geneva Smitherman calls straight talk, the Africanized style of speaking the English language, which is deeply rooted in the African American oral tradition. As a pedagogical project, Real Talk builds on two things. One, it builds on the importance of dialect awareness. that is becoming aware of one's own dialect. 2, it seeks to infuse the fundamental principles of social-linguistic variation into school curriculum. Sami Ali summarizes his project as such. This is, instead of reading it, I'm just going to explain it very quickly. So, Sami Ali did an interview with JT. Does anybody know who JT is? There's no reason for you to know who JT is. This is the bigger figure. Big hip-hop in the Bay Area, California. So he did an interview with him. And what he did is video and audio tape that, and then gave each of the students an audio of the interview, and asked them to transcribe the interviews exactly as they hear it. Invariably, Sami Ali writes, some students will standardize the speech samples while others will vernacularize them. That's the kicker. So give them an interview. Let them transcribe it as they hear it. It does not fail that because there are certain linguistic norms in the African American vernacular English, it does not fail that students will standardize it. So in one sentence, Samia, and this is the bigger figure talking, he says, he ran everything. Did you hear this?
Yeah.
He ran everything. Okay. So, at least half of the class would transcribe it as he runs everything. So what Alim does after that, this is him talking. We take this one feature, the third person singular, of the rapper's spoken speech and conduct a sociolinguistic analysis of his speech, which leads to a larger understanding of the structure and the systematic nature of the spoken speech. Students are not only learning about sociolinguistics in this case, about some sociolinguistic variation of the spoken word, they are also being introduced to a curriculum that introduces it as a viable modality for learning. For me, at this point, is what Alim is concretizing, almost doing cultural studies. Students understood sociolinguistic varieties not by reading about it, which they actually did after the project was over, but by transcribing, by studying, by reflecting on their everyday speech as well as the community around them. In another project called Language in My Life, which I will deal with when I come back here, back in May, students were charged with carrying an ethnographic notebook where they document the linguistic practice of their local community and the linguistic shift in different contexts and modes of speech. So simply have a notebook where when you're talking around the dinner table is different than when you're talking to a teacher. Talking down the hall is different than in another context. In fact, thanks to this project, they discovered a term that was only used in and within the 2.5 square miles. That's it. Because of that, of conducting that research. My point fairly quickly is this. This is a different kind of praxis. The research comes as notes from the underground where the realization of one's locality is not only crucial, but it's the central point of research. Praxis here means the blending of theory and practice, but not as we understand it in a graduate course. Praxis is here turned into a method of critical consciousness, a pedagogical method for grounding theorizing. Only then, as Paulo would argue, can education become a practice of liberation. Only then can our students become a radical conjuncturalist. Ones who are thinking about radical possibilities from their everyday, especially their everyday speech. Magaguchi, and I realize the time, sums it up nicely. A Japanese philosopher, and I highly recommend you take a note of his name. Ideas, he argues, genuinely useful for education do not originate with those in central authority issuing orders. They arise rather among free spirits at the far margins of power. They eccentric thinkers, cut loose from their moorings, but at the same time constantly digging deep in search of a vein of universal knowledge. It is when such thinkers first determine to educate themselves and then decide to be of some use to others and to society that truly valid theories emerge. I am currently involved in a spoken word project at the high school where I'm conducting research. I was hoping to leave you with, if possible, with a final tune of poetic speed. Take a note of this name, poetic speed. Oh, it's not it.
Was it an iTunes? No.
It was in the... That's quite all right. Looks like we don't have it. But I am going to close here, and I very, very, very much appreciate your attention. I know you had better things to do. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Awad. I think we have a little bit of time. Are there one or two questions that people want to pose to our speaker? Any thoughts, issues?
Thank you for that. As you were talking about Project Citizen, it was getting me thinking about the idea of participatory democracy, and I see a lot of overlaps in that, and I was wondering if you could speak to those overlaps, or if if one informs the other.
Indeed. The idea of participative democracy, it's kind of one feeds into the other. The one thing that I emphasize, and I really want us to at least think about, start to think about it, is the pedagogical element. A lot of us who teach in schools or work in schools, we're always confronted by, okay, how do you apply this? How do you think through this? And Project Citizen becomes kind of a nice way into, nice is probably not the word, but it's a way to enter that discussion and propose it as a concrete possibility for a lot of us.
Mm.
Thank you for your talk as well. And I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit more to the word in spoken word.
The spoken word?
To the spoken word. It's a component that I'm also working on, and I just was wondering if you could share.
We got to exchange emails.
We don't have to, but it's a part of my own study, so I'd appreciate if you could share.
Yes. I came to realize that through my work in hip-hop, that there is a slight shift that people are making towards what is traditionally known as politically conscious or conscious hip-hop. So a lot of spoken word performance would be in that category. And as a result, I got really interested in doing that. So what I did is I actually brought in 2 spoken word poets in Ottawa to work and offer workshops with the students. And so it became kind of almost like a pedagogical moment where they exchange ideas, and the end result of the workshop is to produce something from the students. So it is something to think about, not only in terms of research, but also in terms of the applicability of the spoken word. But we could talk on that, definitely. See a hand, last hand.
But yeah, again, thank you for your talk. It's very invigorating. But I'm just interested maybe to hear your thoughts around the whole issue of participating in democracy, because particularly we look at speech forms and the pedagogical potential. And so if the emphasis is on, a lot like, for example, the Black vernacular English, and using it as a pedagogical approach, then are we really doing a service to some of these students who will have, power and access to particular forms of knowledge, but you're also at the same time, not emphasizing access to the dominant ways of speaking, because that's what the real power is. And so, are we not doing the disservice in that way as well?
No, we're not. And it's a kind of a recurrent theme in a lot of sites. And the question is, are we doing a disservice if we engage and kind of valorize the spoken word, particularly the African American vernacular English? Clearly not. We need to start somewhere. So if that is the premise, then starting somewhere is starting from where the students are at. But ultimately, the discussion should be about, why are we afraid of it? Why can't we think about it as a possibility? Not to do away with the question of power and the question of accessing power through language, because eventually that is what is intent of Alim's project, is how do you become aware of your own speech, and in the process discover other speeches, other forms of speeches, including quote-unquote standardized English. So it becomes almost like thinking about the linguistic variation of the speech itself, and in the process discovering your own as well as others. In the U.S., particularly where Alim is working, Spanish is a big thing, and so the Hispanics kind of speak English in a particular way. So the idea is to start to think, the kind of a cognitive process of thinking about language itself, the different speeches around it. And in the process, try to think about the standardized as a variation, not the ultimate God kind of thing, but as a variation that you need to master, you need to access, you need to kind of know about.
I have a question, maybe comment, I don't know. But while you were talking about, this discourse, just thinking about, this reminds me of Ali G. I don't know if you are familiar.
Yeah.
So what do you think about his position? Because, he just used this language, and he just consciously making mistakes and everything. So somehow, for me, it's some kind of deconstruction, just crush the dominant, norms, linguistic norms, everything. So
the beauty of Ali G is actually shows how fragile what we call standard. Like in a second, it shows you the stupidity of it. Just like just in a flip of a second, like the way he talks, and he will be talking to Congress people, whatever, and then all of a sudden you realize how stupid they look, actually. But the other thing that Ali G does in a kind of problematic way, at least for me, is the old process of appropriation. And I think we need to seriously, as much as we could celebrate him crumbling and deconstructing in a fantastic way the standard and showing its stupidity, At the same time, we need to question, okay, so the whole question of appropriation is quite significant there. That we need to, at least for me, we need to really seriously question why he's doing what he's doing.
Okay.
After all, he's making double money out of it.
Okay, yeah.
Should we take that as a lesson?
I was very struck by the third example you gave of the young people helping to negotiate the peace agreement. And I wonder if your interpretation of the first strategy they employed, which was basically education through the heart rather than the head, through using the arts, has some broader implications elsewhere in the world. Because, I mean, they kind of cut through the rhetoric and the intellect and the rationalizations. And I wonder what, my question is twofold. What are the broader implications of that pedagogy, if you will? And what thinking went into, what their discussions were, if you know about them, that led them down that route, because apparently they were quite effective. So,
I think, and this is the other part that we do not pay very much attention to, which opening possibilities to the students. Once you open possibilities, you will be surprised. You will always be surprised. Working on my spoken word project, the students were the least spoken people who are extremely shy, sit in the back. They're shy and all of a sudden. The example that these students are offering is to think outside the box on the one hand and think about possibilities. But those possibilities are locally grounded and rooted. And in many ways, it's trying to, using effective strategies to do that. The broader implication, at least for me, is the need, from the student's perspective, to engage him and offer and take them probably more serious than we usually do. And once you do that, I mean, as you have seen in all of the cases that I offered, they take it up. They take it up very seriously. The most significant, and I actually did talk to these kids, the most significant is the transformative that happened to them in the process. I mean, they became champions of peace. Two of them are actually now working for Amnesty International.
Well, I guess what was behind the second part of my question was, what were you privy to, and what was the nature of their own dialogue? I get that was grounded in the local, that was clear from the cultural forms. But there is a more, I don't want to say universal, but a grander message many of us could take away from what they do, which is they just cut through the talk. The rhetoric was cut through. They talked in a local dance vernacular, but they said something that got people to move to a different space. And so I wonder what went into their political growth, their thinking to get there. I mean, you wouldn't get there through the ordinary educational system. That would not have been what official knowledge would have taught you how to do. So how did they arrive at that?
I wasn't fully privy to the internal discussion among the group, but the message that I got from talking to them is there was a lot of discussion that was taking place. How best to approach this, because they knew
what was at stake.
Exactly. Yeah. And they have tried all possible strategies, and finally, fantastically, I might add, things just brought into perspective. There is no luck to it, but there was part of me that was surprised by everything working at once.
Yeah.
So there is that element as well, but there was a lot of thinking that was taking place there.
Were the youth of the two groups that were warring, did they represent both all the parties?
The kids, the
Yes.
youth themselves, they represented, actually, yes, both.
And the cultural forms also represented those histories?
That's correct.
That's,
Yeah.
okay, thanks, that's
Yeah.
helpful.
Please join me once more in thanking Awad Ibrahim. There is going to be a panel discussion, but let's have a